Hey, hi everybody. I am not actually using my webcam this time, but I hope that you are able to hear me. Um, so I'm going to keep this pretty short. I want to just go over some of the basic causes for basic for a bad memory. We make a lot of inaccurate memories and memory errors. You probably already read some information about false memory implantation, especially Elizabeth Loftus's work. And so today I want to go over just four different causes of memory errors that are very common to us. We've talked about episodic memory, autobiographical memory, and except for those with hyperthymesia, we tend to think that we are remembering stuff when really we're either not remembering um, all of it, remembering part of it inaccurately, or potentially remembering something that didn't actually happen. Okay, so the four major causes of memory errors: intrusion error, schematic error, misinformation, and false memories. So we'll talk about those today. Okay, so here's an example of just a memory error. It can be it's one of those, but this just happened many years ago. And it's really interesting because one of the more common situations of memory errors happen when things are in the news. So when we hear about them, there's emotion involved, and then there's lots of pictures and more information. We hear it a lot, right? So that happens a lot when something happens and it kind of blows up in the media. And here's an example. So there's an airplane in Amsterdam that lost power to two engines, and it crashed into the side of a building in Amsterdam. There were 193 participants that were interviewed 10 months later and asked about things that happened. More than half of the participants reported seeing the crash on TV, okay, more than half, when, oops, in reality, the crash was actually never shown on TV or on any film. So people were, bombarded with hearing about it, listening to radio or to TV or reading about it in newspapers, but they weren't actually ever seeing it on TV. So, or seeing an actual real life visual of it. And more than half believe that they were 10 months later. So it's interesting that we can develop memories that actually were not there. Okay, and so a question is, how on earth do we do this? And why do we do this? Because wouldn't it behoove us and our brains wanting efficiency to keep memories intact over time? So it's a really good question, and we're going to dive into that eventually. But I want to look at different memory errors. And here's an example of a famous study. And this one was there was a room that was set up, and it looks kind of like an office, right? This is the actual room. And each participant in the study, one by one, went and sat in the room, and they said, okay, can you just sit here for a while? We'll be back to get you and take you to the actual experiment. Kind of considered like a holding space, right? So the participant would sit there and, for about 15 minutes. And then they would actually ask them, once they were out of the room, they would ask them to write down the items that they had seen in the office. And they wrote down a whole bunch of items, but there were several items that they mentioned that actually were not in the office. Okay, and some of those items were, for example, and this is back in the 70s, so you can see there's no computers. But for example, telephones. There was no telephone. There was no paper on the desk. Okay, that kind of thing, and those kinds of things that are typically found in offices. Okay, were reported as being there when actually hadn't. So that is an example of, actually, this example of what we would consider to be schema. Okay, the expectation that we are going to, see certain things, hear certain things, be surrounded by certain things that have already adhered to our knowledge of and our understanding of what an office should have in it. Okay, and that can have good and bad consequences, right? But this is one of the first studies that actually looked at that, and yeah, so people tend to, again, to make up what they think that they see or they think should be there. Okay, so the first type of error we're going to look at is intrusion errors. So this is when you have existing knowledge and then something happens, okay, time goes by, and the new information comes through. So the new information during that time, okay, whatever that new information might be, that information interferes with existing knowledge, okay? And so the existing knowledge and the event of that, what happened with that situation, becomes all kind of mushed up together, and it ends up intruding on some of the actual things that happened. So, so if I went to a wedding, okay, for my best friend, right? So went to a wedding 10 years ago. I attended the wedding, and I remember where it was, who was there, details about it, right? Because some in weddings, they're kind of a big celebration, so you would probably remember more than you normally would in any other situation. And so the event was that wedding. So over time, and of course, the longer the time, okay, the worse our memory is of that particular event. So maybe over 10 years, I'd actually been to several weddings, okay, or even 2 or 3 weddings, okay? And so the stuff that happened in those other weddings, okay, interfered with what I actually remembered about that first wedding. And so when you ask me about that first wedding, I'm probably going to put in pieces of information that are not true, and that might be true for a different wedding, but are not true for that particular wedding when asked about it. So, so that would be an example of how new information can get in the way of existing knowledge. Okay, oh, this is the same thing. I'm going to skip through this. Okay, so another issue of memory errors and intrusion would be this example. This is part of an actual study. So Nancy arrived at the cocktail party. She looked around the room to see who was there. She went to talk with her professor. She felt she had to talk to him, but was a little nervous about just what to say. A group of people started to play charades. Nancy went over and had some refreshments. The hors d'oeuvres were good, but she was not interested in talking to the rest of the people at the party. After a while, she decided she had had enough and left the party. Okay, so so both groups in this study read this passage. One group, called the neutral group, okay, were just asked, what do you think this was about? What, who was Nancy? What was she like? By just reading this, what type of information can you gather? Okay, and so people would just kind of interpret it, pretty much just like she wanted to talk to a professor. Why you talk to professors? You talk to professors about your work. She was kind of nervous to talk to him. People were playing games, and she was eating, refreshments, which is very much part of our schema for parties. But then if she, sometimes we've even had this happen where, kind of start feeling like, I don't know if I really want to talk to people in this party. And so you just end up leaving. Okay, so all of this stuff is kind of like, okay, that all makes sense. And that's essentially what was being reported by the people in the neutral group. Then the other group is called the intrusion group. Okay, and so the intrusion group read this. Nancy woke up feeling sick again, and she wondered if she really was pregnant. how would she tell the professor she had another the professor she'd been seeing, and the money was another problem. So they read this before they read that other passage. So they were, primed. They were set up to have some sort of expectation going into it. So when you go back to this, it makes sense when you look at that they would have a completely different sense of what was happening there. So what happened was that the propositions, meaning the propositions in the neutral group, okay, so were just the statements of what was happening, okay? And so in the theme condition, okay, so actually, okay, they called the theme condition a brief prologue before of the theme of the passage was to be remembered. So they wanted the passage to be remembered. And so they found is that if you were in the theme condition, okay, the more intrusions you were given, okay, the better the memory. So you were given the theme beforehand, and so you remembered it better. So in the neutral condition, when there was no theme, you actually had worse memories or fewer intrusions in there and worse memory of the passage. And so this kind of indicates that that even though we do have our own schema for what's happening in a situation like a party, that sometimes that schema actually, because it's so familiar to us, we don't remember everything about it. Because do we really need to remember everything about it is the question. Our brains typically just want the gist of what's happening. But when we kind of add a little drama to it, when we add a backstory to it, it's kind of like, aha, now I see. Now I know why she was afraid to talk to the professor. Now I know why she seemed a little nervous. And so there was definitely a better memory of the passage there. So the intrusions actually helped that memory in this particular situation, but intrusions also, if you're thinking of, if you want someone to remember everything in a passage as is, okay, the intrusions are actually, interrupting or intruding on that memory, so you're going to have a different meaning from it, okay? So anyway, there's better memory of the passage, but it was only because it was kind of centered within this framework, specific framework. Okay, this is another example of an intrusion. Cause of faulty memory. So it's called the Diess-Rudiger-McDermott procedure. And so this is a pretty simple procedure. So participants had to read a list. The list was like bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, wake, snooze. And then later, they were asked to recall all of the words that they memorized. Okay, there's another type of another variation of this where they were actually given a whole bunch of words and they had to mark down which words were on the list. And so many people recalled the word sleep, even though it was not on the list. So why is that? Because sleep is is an expectation of a word that should be in this particular cluster of words. But if it's not, we tend to just kind of pretend like it is. Okay, because why wouldn't sleep be in there? So even though this is a simple study, it still indicates that how easy it is because of our schema, because of our the intrusion errors, and how easily confused our brains can get, that false memories by misinformation or by the encoding that we've done is pretty easy to do. Okay. By the way, this could be a really great method for your study if you haven't started yours already. Okay, so this is just some of the data that that we looked at for the DRM paradigm. So you can see that because of the theme uniting the list, like the theme of sleep, participants can remember about 90% of the words that they encountered, but they're just as likely to recall the list theme word even though it was not presented. Okay, so you can see here the words from the actual list, about 90%, and then any unrelated words, very few, maybe 4%. And then the mistaken recall of theme words, there was about 80%. Okay, so the recall, very few unrelated words, which makes sense, but the mistaken words were as much occurred as frequently as the actual words from the list. Okay, so schematic knowledge is what I mentioned. Is so we have this knowledge represented by these sort of pockets of information represented physiologically by bundles of neurons, right? So our neurons are, so our schemas are essentially expectations of situations or a script of a situation that we know is going to happen. We've experienced it, like I mentioned before, going into a restaurant. Okay, so we know what's going to happen when we go into a restaurant. So in this case, we know what a highway looks like. Okay, but if we put a palm tree or something very odd, okay, in the middle of a street, that's going to break our schema. All right. So when something interrupts what we are expecting to happen or is kind of strange, then we tend to have kind of a disequilibrium of as far as our memory, the quality of our memory. Okay, because suddenly, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Is this really a highway? You start questioning what you have already set so clearly and so hardwired into your brain as what a highway exists. And so this makes us question ourselves, and we don't always like to have to question ourselves, right? So the palm tree makes us think a little bit differently about what a highway is, or anything odd does that. And so when it interferes that way, then we tend to have problems kind of scratching our head like what is that, what's happening there. Okay, so it can help us when remembering an event. So like you remember the first thing that happened, like say the last time you went to a restaurant, the last time you went to your favorite restaurant, the last time you went to a restaurant on vacation. Okay, so you probably remember those things or might remember those things. Okay, those are all restaurants, okay? And there are different restaurants in different places, in different situations, but they're all restaurants, which is good because you can then remember and tell people about that particular restaurant you went on when you were on vacation. But schema or schemata, which is a plural, can also cause us to make errors when remembering an event. So if you remember seeing magazines in a dentist's office, even if they weren't there, okay? And because normally magazines are somewhere in a dentist's office, you have vivid memories of reading the different types of magazines and how you felt and thinking, oh, this is kind of weird magazine, but I guess I'll just pick it up and read it. So there's different types of magazines, and usually they're found in a dentist's office, but you're really not paying a lot of attention. Maybe you're nervous or you're kind of looking around, and then someone asks you later, were there magazines? You probably would say yes, even though you don't really know. So do you really know that? Or are you remembering something faulty based on your expectations and in your schema? Okay. So we have another cause of inaccurate memories, which is called the misinformation effect. And so this is when we have an event and then we get some misleading information about the event. Time passes and suddenly the misleading information becomes part of that event, and now we can't talk about the event accurately. Okay, so as you notice in all these little models, time is an essential part of this of these memory problems, right? So over time, our memory can decay or become interfered with, and that's what leads us to having inaccurate memories. Okay, so examples of misleading information, misinformation effect. So the famous Loftus and Palmer study in 1974. So they had participants view a series of slides depicting a car accident, and they asked how fast were the cars going when they blanked each other. So we use different verbs. You can see at the bottom, it says they used contacted, they used the verb hit, bumped, collided, and smashed. And even though there weren't really a lot of I don't even think there's significant differences, we still can see a difference between smashed and between contacted or hit, right? So if you are able to kind of throw in a verb that has a different, level of meaning, whether it's a stronger meaning or weaker meaning or weaker effect, then that actually could cause you to have a memory that is something that you didn't know at all, or something that has changed because of using one particular verb, okay, or one particular change in stimulus. And of those who said smashed, a large percentage actually also said they remembered seeing broken glass from the car windows when there were none. So smashed has some pretty significant effect here. Okay. And then false memory. So autobiographical memory. So we definitely talked about that before, right? And that these are also memories that can be implanted that, when we remember, even though we have the self-reference effects, or we talked about how stuff that we remember visually, we remember better if we are actually part of that picture, say. So we talked about selfies, kind of how maybe that's, one important reason or psychological reason why we do selfies. So we remember what the event was. So there have been lots of studies done where researchers have been able to implant false memories quite easily. Such as making participants believe they had become ill eating egg salad as children, to the point where then when they were presented with egg salad, they felt ill. So it has sort of deep-reaching effects when you can implant a false memory. Okay. So entire events can be implanted into memory, and like I was saying before, imagery can be extremely compelling and extremely helpful, more helpful than just using a word or suggestion. It can visual, right? We are all visual learners, and imagery is part of memory from the very beginning of the information processing to the very end. So a picture can actually create a memory. So in this study, participants were shown a faked photo, okay, so B, created from a real childhood snapshot, as in A, so you can see it's the same father and son. Then with this prompt, many participants were led to a vivid, detailed recollection of the balloon ride, even though it never occurred. So what they did was they would find pictures of the person when they were a child, and they would put them in a different event that never happened, and just that connection between them being in, say in this case, in a hot air balloon, they were able to talk about vivid details of that, even though it never happened. Okay, so it's again very easy to use pictures to just a little bit of doctoring, right, to cause false memories. And then one last thing here, this is another example of using a visual to implant a false memory. So this is a picture, all it is a picture of of a bunch of students, like in first grade, right? So one of these students was the participant. And so they were just told a story about how, they were sort of, kind of naughty and misbehaving in class. And then they would actually look at this picture and they would say, oh, yeah, there's me. Oh, yeah, I remember. I always picked on that girl. That girl was always mean to me, or that boy, I kind of was a bully towards, or whatever. And so they were able to talk about in detail how they were misbehaving in class by just a picture, and B, a suggestion that they were poorly behaved. So again, all it takes is just a little story and a little doctored up photo, or just an actual photo of the person's childhood. And because those memories are far long ago, remember time is integral in this whole thing, then we're very malleable and susceptible to suggestions. So our brains do have a lot of problems as far as remembering stuff correctly, or remembering the correct thing at all, or pretending and making up stories as well. So those are just a few of the major causes of the memory errors. We're going to talk more about memory errors and sort of how to avoid those as well, and we'll talk about those in the next class. Okay, thank you.